When my neighbors called my car a piece of junk, they laughed so hard you'd think they'd won something. To them, it was just an old, rusted-out vehicle taking up space, a sore spot in their perfect little neighborhood. What they didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the car wasn't just a car. It was a rare collector's item, worth more than $2 million. And hidden beneath its faded paint was history they couldn't even imagine. But the car was just the beginning. While they mocked me, I quietly held something far more powerful. The deed to their block. Yes, the very houses they lived in, the streets they strutted on, the lawns they boasted about, to all trace back to me. Their insults lit the fuse, but their ignorance would bring the fire. And soon enough, I would show them exactly who owned what. The morning sun always hit my driveway first, bouncing off the faded paint of the old car that sat there like a stubborn relic of another time. To me, it wasn't just a car, it was history, legacy, and treasure rolled into one. But to my neighbors, it was nothing more than junk. They didn't see the value in the small scratches, the hand-built frame, or the rare emblem on the hood that spoke to collectors. They only saw rust, dents, and a machine they thought was better suited for the scratch. Every time I looked out my window and saw it sitting there, I smiled. Every time they walked past and sneered, I smiled even more. Because while they only saw the outside, I knew the truth hidden underneath. The neighborhood was one of those neatly pressed, picture-perfect places where lawns were trimmed on the same day, hedges were sculpted like art, and cars in driveways were expected to shine. If your grass grew an inch too long, Karen from across the street would be knocking on your door with a frown and a copy of the HOA rules. And if your car didn't look like it had just rolled out of a dealership, the whispers started. They believed in appearances, in making everything look perfect, even if it wasn't. I didn't care about appearances. I cared about substance. And my car, though battered, was substance of the highest order. I'd bought it years ago at an auction where collectors from all over the country had gathered. Some had walked in with millions to spend, others with reputations that made people step aside. I had gone in quiet, unnoticed, and when the bidding war began for this particular car, most people laughed when I raised my hand. "He'll never afford it," someone muttered behind me. But what they didn't know was that I'd been saving for this exact moment, researching, preparing, and waiting. I had studied this car like a student studies for the most important exam of his life. When the gavel came down and the car was mine, I felt something that couldn't be measured in money, ownership of a legend. Back then, it gleamed. Its paint was flawless, the chrome shining like a mirror, and the engine purred with the kind of power you could feel in your bones. But over the years, I left it as it was, not polishing away its wear, not repainting the body. Every scratch and spot of rust told a story, and while I knew a simple restoration would fetch me more than $2 million, I loved the authenticity of its current state. It wasn't a trophy. It was living proof of history, untouched and raw. Of course, my neighbors didn't understand any of this. They didn't care about rare engines or vintage design. All they saw was a car that didn't match their perfectly polished SUVs and luxury sedans. The first complaint came in the form of a letter. "Your vehicle violates community standards," it read, stamped with the HOA's logo. I crumpled it and tossed it in the trash. A week later, Karen knocked on my door. She crossed her arms and tilted her head with that practiced mix of superiority and false kindness. "You know, that car really brings down the look of our street," she said. "If you can't fix it, maybe it's time to tow it away. We're all about property values here." I leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "It's not going anywhere." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Suit yourself. But don't be surprised when the HOA finds you." I closed the door without another word. Behind me, I could hear her muttering, no doubt preparing to rally the others. And rally she did. Soon enough, every neighbor had an opinion about my car. I'd catch them shaking their heads as they walked by, whispering to each other at the mailbox, pointing like children when they thought I wasn't looking. Some even laughed openly. "Why does he keep that junk heap?" One man chuckled as he loaded groceries into his shiny crossover. His wife joined in, giggling like it was the funniest thing in the world. Still, I stayed quiet. Let them laugh. Let them sneer. They thought their words had weight, but they didn't know I had patience like steel. I had no reason to defend myself, not yet. What they didn't understand was that the car was more than just a possession. It was leverage, a secret waiting to be revealed. The situation escalated when the HOA president called me to a meeting. They gathered in the community hall, sitting in neat rows of folding chairs, all wearing their judgment on their faces. I walked in calmly, hands in my pockets, feeling their eyes on me. The president cleared his throat and began. "Mr. Daniels, we've received multiple complaints about the vehicle in your driveway. It doesn't comply with our community's appearance standards. Frankly, it's an eyesore." A chorus of nods followed, some muttering agreement. "We're asking you to remove it," he continued. "If you fail to do so, we will have no choice but to impose fines and potentially arrange for it to be towed." I let the words hang in the air for a moment, then smiled faintly. "Noted." That was all I said. Their brows furrowed, their whispers grew louder, but I stood and walked out before they could say more. I could feel their frustration burning holes in my back as I left, and it only made me grin. They thought they had power. They thought their rules bound me, but they didn't know who they were dealing with. A week later, the tow truck came. I heard the heavy engine rumble down the street, chains rattling as it parked in front of my house. Neighbors gathered like it was a parade, some even pulling out their phones to record the moment they thought I would be humiliated. The driver jumped down, clipboard in hand, and walked up to my car. He hooked the chains to the bumper, preparing to drag it away, but then something happened that none of them expected. I walked out slowly, holding my keys, and without a word, I slid into the driver's seat. The crowd quieted, curiosity sparking. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. It wasn't the sputter of junk, but the deep, commanding growl of a rare masterpiece. The sound echoed through the neighborhood, rattling windows, making children cover their ears. Gasps erupted. Whispers spread. Someone even dropped their phone in shock. I eased the car forward, the tow chains clanking uselessly as the driver jumped back in surprise. Slowly, deliberately, I drove it down the street, the polished emblem on the hood catching the light just enough for the right eyes to notice. A few collectors in the crowd widened their eyes in recognition, mouths falling open as they realized what it was. This wasn't junk. This was worth more than their houses combined. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The car spoke for me. As I circled the block and returned, their laughter was gone, replaced with silence and awe. Karen's face was pale, her lips pressed so tight they nearly disappeared. The HOA president rubbed his temple, already realizing they'd made a mistake, and the rest just stared. Their pride shattered in the rumble of an engine they didn't understand. That day, they learned a lesson. Not everything old is worthless. Some things, no matter how rough they look, hold more value than all the shiny new toys in the world. And me. I knew this was only the beginning. They thought they had the upper hand, but soon, they'd discover the truth I'd been holding even closer than the car itself. Because while the car was worth millions, it wasn't my only card. The block they lived on, the very ground beneath their houses, was mine. And soon enough, I'd reveal it. The silence after I parked the car was heavier than the roar of its engine had been. Neighbors who had gathered to watch me be humiliated now stood frozen in place, their eyes darting between each other, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. A few whispered, as if saying the name of the car too loudly might shatter their fragile pride. Karen, who had been so smug before, now stared as though she'd swallowed something sour. Her arms were still crossed, but the confidence in her posture had drained away. The tow truck driver removed his chains with a shrug, muttering something about not getting paid enough for this, and left without another word. That alone felt like a victory. Watching the truck roll away while I sat behind the wheel of a machine worth millions was like watching their little crusade collapse in real time. But I didn't gloat. I simply stepped out, locked the car, and walked back toward my front door. My silence made it worse for them. It left space for their shame to echo louder than any words I could have spoken. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table. Through the blinds, I could see them still standing outside, unsure whether to leave or confront me again. Eventually, Karen's husband tugged her arm, and the crowd dispersed like children caught in mischief. But I knew this wasn't over. People like them couldn't accept being wrong. They would regroup, whisper behind closed doors, and try again. The HOA wasn't done with me, not by a long shot. 2 days later, the next letter arrived. It was slipped under my door rather than mailed, a sign of their impatience. This time, the language was harsher. Failure to comply with community standards will result in escalating fines and possible legal action. I chuckled when I read it. They had no idea how meaningless those threats were to me. Still, I kept the letter, tucking it into a folder with all the others. I was building a collection of their arrogance, something I could pull out later if I needed to remind them of their own words. That evening, I took the car out again, not to flaunt it, but because I enjoyed the drive. The way the engine responded to every touch, the way the road seemed to bow beneath its power, it reminded me why I had fought so hard to own it in the first place. But as I drove back into the neighborhood, I could feel the weight of eyes on me. Curtains twitched, porches filled with silent watchers. They wanted to say something, but the memory of that engine's growl still lingered in their ears. None of them dared call it junk now. The real trouble came at the next HOA meeting. They had called me in again, though I knew they weren't expecting me to show. But I walked into that little community hall with my head high, taking a seat at the back while their whispers filled the room. The president cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses before speaking. "Mr. Daniels," he began, his voice tighter than before, "your vehicle has caused disruption in the neighborhood. While some may find it impressive, it still does not align with the appearance guidelines set forth by our community charter." Karen, sitting in the front row, couldn't resist adding, "It doesn't matter if it's worth $1 million. Rules are rules." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. 2 million, actually. The room went quiet. Eyes widened, jaws tightened, and I could almost hear their collective pride cracking under the weight of that number. A few exchanged looks, their previous complaints suddenly sounding ridiculous, even to themselves. The president cleared his throat again. "Regardless of value, the car remains problematic. We must enforce our rules fairly, Mr. Daniels." I smiled faintly. "Then enforce them. Fine me, tow me, do whatever you think you can. Just make sure you've read the law carefully before you try." That was all I said, and I stood to leave. I didn't need to explain further, because I knew something they didn't. Their authority stopped where my ownership began. They were playing a game on land they didn't realize wasn't truly theirs. That night, as I sat on my porch sipping coffee, Karen stormed across the street. She didn't bother knocking, just marched right up to me with fire in her eyes. "You think you're better than us because of that car," she snapped. "This neighborhood has rules. You can't just do whatever you want." I set my cup down slowly. "Karen, let me tell you something. That car is worth more than your house, your car, and everything in it combined. And yet, I'm not the one knocking on your door telling you how to live. Maybe think about that before you lecture me again." Her mouth opened, then closed, her face turning red. She wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Finally, she spun on her heel and stomped back across the street. I knew she wouldn't stop, though. People like her never did. The following week was filled with little acts of defiance from the neighborhood. Someone left anonymous notes on my windshield, calling me arrogant. A few kids, likely coached by their parents, shouted insults as they biked past. Even the mailman seemed hesitant to approach my driveway, as if the tension was contagious. It was amusing, really, watching them struggle to fight a battle they couldn't win. But then, one afternoon, I saw something that made me laugh out loud. A group of neighbors stood at the corner, huddled in conversation, and one of them had a clipboard. They were drafting a petition, no doubt planning to rally signatures against me. As if a piece of paper with names could outweigh the truth I held in my possession. That night I pulled out my own set of papers, deeds, titles, records, all neatly organized in a locked drawer. I had purchased the land beneath this entire block years ago, through a quiet deal. One that gave me ownership rights most of them couldn't even imagine. Their houses might have been theirs, but the ground they rested on, the utilities that ran through it, the streets they drove on, all of it traced back to me. They thought they could push me around because of a car, but soon enough, they would discover who really held power here. For now, though, I let them play their game. I let them write their petitions and file their complaints, because the truth was, I enjoyed watching their frustration grow. The more they fought me, the sweeter their defeat would taste. And when the time was right, when their arrogance peaked, I would drop the truth on them like a hammer. Until then, I kept driving the car. I kept parking it in my driveway, letting it sit proudly in the sun where everyone could see. No more hiding, no more quiet patience. The car had already spoken once, but I was preparing for the day when the land itself would speak louder than any engine ever. The neighborhood was restless now, the balance of power shifting in ways they couldn't yet understand. And me, I was just getting started. The days that followed felt different. The air in the neighborhood had shifted, thick with tension that everyone felt but no one dared address directly. People who once waved or nodded as they passed, now looked the other way. Conversations that used to happen casually on porches, now hushed when I walked by. I could feel their resentment, their unease, and their determination building like storm clouds. They had failed to shame me over the car, but I knew they wouldn't give up. The HOA, especially Karen, wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. One morning, I found a fresh letter taped to my front door. This one wasn't just a complaint, it was an official notice. Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in legal escalation. It read, stamped with their cheap logo. They were bluffing, of course. Their authority was limited, and they had no idea just how little ground they truly stood on. Still, I slipped the letter into my growing folder. Each one was a reminder of their arrogance, a breadcrumb trail leading to the moment I'd finally turn the tables. That evening, as I stood in my driveway polishing the car's chrome, Karen marched over again. She had a folder under her arm and determination in her stride. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she hissed, planting herself in front of me. "Well, we've drafted a petition. Over 20 households have signed it. You'll be forced to comply now." I leaned against the car, arms folded, and studied her face. She looked almost triumphant, like she'd finally cornered me. "A petition," I repeated calmly. "That's cute." Her eyes narrowed. "This isn't cute. This is serious. The HOA is prepared to fine you daily until that car is gone. We'll take you to court if we have to." I smiled faintly. "Karen, do you really think a piece of paper with a few signatures changes anything? You've been so focused on what's parked in my driveway, you haven't bothered to notice what you're standing on." Her confusion flickered briefly, but arrogance covered it up fast. "Don't play games. You can't intimidate us with your little riddles." I shrugged, leaving her to stew in her own ignorance. She stormed off again, no doubt convinced she was closing in on victory. But the truth was, she was only digging herself deeper into a hole she couldn't climb out of. The next HOA meeting was louder than the last. They weren't just annoyed anymore. They were angry. People raised their voices, slammed their fists on tables, and pointed fingers as if I were some criminal who'd invaded their pristine world. I sat in the back, calm and silent, watching the chaos unfold. The president finally managed to restore order and declared that if I didn't remove the car within 30 days, they would pursue legal action. 30 days, he repeated firmly. As though the number itself carried weight, Karen smirked at me from across the room, her arms crossed in smug satisfaction. The room seemed to side with her, nodding, whispering, feeding off her false confidence. I simply raised an eyebrow. gave the faintest of nods, and walked out without a word. Their cheers at my back told me they thought they'd won. That was fine. Let them celebrate early. The best victories come after your opponent believes they've already beaten you. Over the next few weeks, I watched them grow bolder. Karen walked her dog past my house twice as often, lingering as if waiting for me to falter. A neighbor down the street started parking deliberately close to my driveway, a petty attempt at intimidation. Others whispered more openly now, their confidence fueled by that 30-day ultimatum. They didn't know that the countdown wasn't mine, it was theirs. Behind closed doors, I began preparing. I pulled out the deeds, the legal documents, the property maps that traced every inch of this neighborhood. Years ago, I had quietly purchased the land through a trust when the previous developer ran into financial trouble. It had been a smart investment at the time, but now it was more than that. Now it was a weapon. The houses may have been theirs, but the dirt beneath the pavement they walked on, the easements and utilities they depended on, they all belonged to me. I consulted with my lawyer, an old friend who knew exactly how to handle situations like this. We reviewed the papers together, confirming every boundary, every right, every clause that gave me authority. You're sitting on a gold mine, he said with a grin. They have no idea what kind of leverage you've got. That's the point, I replied. They think they own the battlefield. They don't even realize they're standing on my land. The day the 30-day deadline arrived, I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, when Karen appeared with a small entourage of neighbors. She had a stack of papers in her hand and victory shining in her eyes. This is your final notice, she announced, loud enough for the whole block to hear. The car must be gone today, or the HOA will take you to court. You've had your fun, but this is the end of it. I stood slowly, setting my cup aside. The end of it, I repeated softly. Funny choice of words, Karen. She thrust the papers toward me. You can't bully this community. We're united against you. I took the papers, glanced at them, and then set them down on the porch railing. Karen, I said evenly, you've spent weeks threatening me with rules and fines, all while standing on ground that doesn't even belong to you. Her brow furrowed. What are you talking about? I reached inside the folder I had placed beside my chair earlier. With deliberate calm, I pulled out the deed and held it up. This, I said, my voice steady but carrying across the gathered crowd, is the deed to this entire block. Every street, every patch of land beneath your house belongs to me. Has for years. The silence was instant. Karen blinked, her mouth opening and closing like she'd forgotten how to speak. The others exchanged nervous glances, their confidence crumbling as the reality set in. One neighbor stepped forward, squinting at the paper as if trying to will it into being fake. You're lying, Karen finally spat, though her voice trembled. Am I? I handed the deed to the man nearest me. Go ahead, read it. He scanned the document, his face draining of color. It's real, he whispered. It's all here. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Karen looked around, searching desperately for someone to back her up, but no one met her eye. Her power was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. I folded my arms. So the next time you want to threaten me with fines or lawsuits, remember who owns the ground under your feet. Remember who pays the taxes on the land your homes sit on. You've been barking at the wrong tree all along. For once, Karen had no comeback. She turned on her heel and stormed off, her little entourage scattering behind her like startled birds. The rest lingered, their eyes filled with a mix of fear, respect, and disbelief. Some approached hesitantly, asking questions, wanting to understand. I didn't rub it in. I simply answered calmly, letting the weight of the truth sink in. That night, the neighborhood was quieter than I had ever known it. No whispers, no mocking laughter, no children shouting rehearsed insults, just silence. They finally understood, and though they didn't like it, they couldn't deny it. But deep down, I knew Karen wouldn't give up. People like her never did. She would regroup, lick her wounds, and try again. And when she did, I would be ready. Because now, the battle wasn't about a car anymore. It was about power, and I held every ounce of it. The shock of my revelation spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, I could feel the shift in the air. The same people who used to sneer at me now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact. Some waved awkwardly, trying to patch up their earlier disdain with forced politeness. Others lingered at their windows, watching me like I was some dangerous figure who had been living among them in disguise. And then there was Karen. I spotted her pacing her porch, phone pressed to her ear, speaking with the kind of urgent tone that carried even across the street. I didn't need to hear every word to know she was plotting. I wasn't surprised. Karen was never the type to retreat quietly. To her, control wasn't just a preference, it was a need. She thrived on telling others what to do, bending them under the weight of her authority, real or imagined. My revelation had stripped that from her in front of everyone. It wasn't just her pride that had been bruised, it was her identity. She couldn't live with that. I knew she'd be back, louder and more desperate than before. The first attempt came in the form of a legal notice. A stiff envelope arrived by courier, delivered with an unnecessary sense of importance. Inside, the HOA claimed my ownership of the land was invalid. Citing a series of half-baked arguments they clearly scraped together in haste. I took the papers straight to my lawyer. He skimmed them, chuckled, and shook his head. They don't have a leg to stand on, he said. This is desperation, Plain and simple. Let them file whatever they want. Every move they make is only going to dig them deeper. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. I didn't need to fight them on every front. I just had to wait. Their anger would blind them, and their mistakes would make themselves. But Karen wasn't content with legal games alone. Soon, whispers turned into rumors. Suddenly, I was the villain of every conversation. According to the gossip, I was planning to evict everyone, bulldoze the homes, and sell the land to developers. Others claimed I was raising property taxes just to squeeze them dry. The rumors had no basis, but fear doesn't need facts to spread. By the end of the week, half the neighborhood was convinced I was some kind of tyrant in disguise. I didn't respond. I let the rumors fester, because the truth was, silence made me more powerful. Every time they speculated, every time they whispered, they gave me more control. Their fear did the work for me. One evening while I was washing the car in my driveway, Karen marched over again. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "You won't get away with this," she snapped. "We've spoken to city officials, and they're looking into your so-called ownership." I rinsed the sponge, squeezed out the water, and looked at her calmly. "And what did the city say?" she faltered. "Just for a second. They're reviewing it." I smiled faintly. "Good. They'll find everything in order. I've paid taxes on this land for years. Karen, while you were busy writing letters and filing complaints, I was making sure every dot and comma was legal. You should know better than to fight battles you can't win." Her face reddened, her hands balled into fists at her sides. But she had no comeback. She stormed off once more, the sound of her heels clicking angrily on the pavement. Over the next few days, Karen tried a new tactic. She went door to door, rallying the neighbors like a politician campaigning for votes. I watched from my porch as she knocked on doors, waving her hands dramatically, her voice carrying through the air. She pointed toward my house more than once, her words sharp and heated. Some neighbors nodded along. Others looked uncomfortable. A few even shut their doors in her face. But she didn't stop. Karen was relentless. Then came the meeting. Not the usual HOA gathering, but an emergency assembly Karen herself called. She rented out the church hall at the edge of the neighborhood and invited everyone to attend. I received an invitation too, slipped into my mailbox with bold letters. Community crisis meeting. I went, of course. I wouldn't have missed it for the world. The hall was packed when I arrived. Families sat in the pews, their faces tense, their whispers buzzing like bees. Karen stood at the front with a microphone, her posture proud, her eyes gleaming with the fire of someone who thought she was about to win back everything she'd lost. "This is not just about one man and his car," she declared, her voice booming through the speakers. "This is about our community, our homes, our future. We cannot allow one person to control us, to hold power over the land we live on. This is America. We stand together against tyranny." The crowd erupted in applause. People clapped, some even cheered, swept up in her rhetoric. I sat in the back, arms folded, a faint smile on my lips. Karen continued, her voice rising with each sentence. "We have lawyers, we have signatures, we have the will of the people, and with all of us united, he cannot win." When the clapping finally died down, I stood. The room quieted instantly. Every head turned toward me. I didn't need a microphone. My voice carried clearly enough. "You've called me a tyrant. You've called me a bully, but all I've done is sit quietly while you insulted me, mocked me, and tried to strip me of what's mine. I never told you how to live. I never knocked on your door to demand you change your life. The only difference between us is this. I came prepared. I invested when no one else cared. I followed the law while you followed Karen's voice." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some looked down at their hands, others shifted uncomfortably. Karen glared at me, her lips pressed into a thin line. I reached into my jacket and pulled out copies of the deed, holding them up. "You can call me names, you can file papers, but the law is on my side. I own this land. That isn't arrogance, that's fact. And I won't use it to destroy you, unless you force me to. All I ask is simple. Leave me and my car alone. Respect my space as I respect yours. But if you continue this war, then yes, I will use every right I have to remind you who holds the ground beneath your feet." The silence that followed was deafening. Karen tried to rally them again, but the fire in her voice didn't spread this time. Too many of them had seen the documents, heard my calm certainty. Fear still lingered in their eyes, but it was mixed now with something else. Doubt about Karen. I left the hall before the meeting ended. As I walked out, I could hear the arguments starting not against me, but against her. People were questioning her tactics, her lies, her obsession. The unity she had boasted about was already cracking. Back home, I sat on my porch again, the cool night air washing over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt truly relaxed. Karen had fired her biggest shot, and it had backfired. The crowd that once cheered her now wavered, divided, uncertain. But I knew Karen wasn't finished. Her pride wouldn't allow her to back down, even if everyone else did. And that was fine with me, because the more she pushed, the more isolated she became. And when the time finally came to end this once and for all, it wouldn't be me against the neighborhood. It would be me against Karen alone. Karen was never one to retreat quietly. I knew that long before this whole saga started. But by the time the HOA meeting backfired on her, it became obvious she was unraveling. Most of the neighbors were tired of her antics now. They wanted peace, not a war over something as trivial as my car in the driveway. But Karen didn't care about PCI, cared about winning. And to her, losing to me was the greatest humiliation she could imagine. The days after the meeting were strangely quiet, too quiet. No more notices in my mailbox, no more complaints, no more angry faces glaring at me across the street. Even Karen had gone silent. For the first time since this ordeal began, I could mow my lawn or sit on my porch without feeling like I was being watched. But the quiet wasn't comforting, it was unsettling. It felt less like calm and more like the moment before a storm. That storm broke one Saturday night. I had just settled in with a book when I heard the sound of engines rumbling outside. Not one, but several. I stepped out onto the porch and froze. There, pulling into the neighborhood, were trucks, flatbeds carrying construction equipment. Behind them were a handful of cars, headlights cutting across the darkness. I recognized the woman standing at the front of the convoy before she even spoke. Karen, hands on her hips, eyes blazing with that same wild determination. Neighbors began gathering in the street, drawn out by the commotion. Murmurs filled the air. What's going on? Why is there heavy machinery? Is she serious? Karen raised her voice for all to hear. This ends tonight. If the so-called owner of this land won't remove his junk and his car, we'll do it for him. This is our community, and no one gets to hold it hostage. The crowd gasped. I didn't move. I just stood on my porch, staring at her. She had gone beyond rumors and legal threats. This was destruction, plain and simple, and she thought she could bulldoze her way through my rights. The first bulldozer started its engine, the growl echoing off the houses. My car sat gleaming in the driveway, its polished surface catching the glow of streetlights. Karen pointed at it like a general commanding her troops. Take it down, she shouted. The driver hesitated. Even he knew this was going too far. Ma'am, are you sure? This doesn't look. Do it, she screamed, cutting him off. I finally moved. Calmly, I walked to the edge of my driveway and pulled a phone from my pocket. One tap, one call, and within minutes the sound of sirens joined the chaos. Red and blue lights painted the night as 3 patrol cars pulled into the street. Officers stepped out, their presence immediately halting the bulldozer in its tracks. Karen spun toward them, indignant. Officers, thank God you're here. Arrest him. He's illegally squatting on our land and threatening our community. The lead officer didn't even look at me. He looked at her. Ma'am, we've received reports that you brought unauthorized construction equipment into a residential area and attempted property damage. Care to explain that? Her face twisted in disbelief. What? No. He's the criminal. He doesn't own this land. He's been lying to everyone. That was when I pulled out the folder I had been carrying all along. Quietly, without drama, I handed it to the officer. Inside were copies of the deed, tax records, and legal ownership papers. He flipped through them, nodding slightly as he read. When he looked up, his expression was firm. Ma'am, he said to Karen, this property is legally his. He's the rightful owner of this entire subdivision, and you just attempted to destroy his property. That's a serious offense. The crowd erupted. Gasps, whispers, a few people even laughed in disbelief. Karen's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She stammered, searching for words. No, this can't be. He's lying. It's fake. But the officer shook his head. Everything checks out. You've overstepped your authority. You're under arrest for attempted destruction of private property, trespassing, and inciting unlawful activity. The moment the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, the neighborhood seemed to exhale as one. The woman who had tormented us all, who had tried to control every aspect of our lives, was finally silenced. Some neighbors clapped, others just stood frozen, unsure how to process it. For me, it was simple. Justice had finally arrived. As they led Karen to the patrol car, she turned her head toward me, her eyes burning with rage. This isn't over, she spat. You think you've won, but the car door slammed shut before she could finish. And just like that, she was gone. The neighborhood was quiet again, but this time the quiet felt different. It wasn't heavy with tension, it was light, almost peaceful. People approached me hesitantly, offering apologies, some even shaking my hand. We didn't know, one man said. She made it sound like you were against us. Another woman nodded. I just wanted to keep my family out of trouble, but thank you for standing your ground. I nodded, accepting their words, though I wasn't bitter. I understood fear. Karen had thrived on it, twisted it, used it to control them, but now, that fear was gone. In the weeks that followed, the HOA collapsed entirely. Without Karen, there was no one left to enforce rules no one wanted. Meetings were canceled. Letters stopped arriving. People planted what they wanted in their yards, painted their houses the colors they liked, and parked in their own driveways without harassment. It was as though the entire neighborhood had been released from a spell. As for me, I enjoyed the quiet victories. Sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, polishing my car on sunny afternoons, waving to neighbors who now waved back with genuine smiles, the tension was gone. The battle was over. And though Karen had sworn it wasn't finished, I knew the truth. Her reign of control was done, and nothing she did could change that. One evening, As the sun dipped low and painted the houses gold, I looked out over the street and felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. All it had taken was patience, preparation, and the refusal to bow to someone else's false power. In the end, Karen destroyed herself. All I had to do was stand firm, and so, the story ended not with shouting, not with violence, but with a simple truth. Real power doesn't come from intimidation. It comes from knowing who you are, and never letting anyone take that from you. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality for more powerful real-life tales. Stay tuned for the next story, you won't want to miss it.